Joining us now is Penn Carey Law School professor Kermit Roosevelt, who specializes in constitutional law. Professor Roosevelt, one of the biggest debates emerging from the Trump administration's recent immigration crackdown is about masked federal agents. We're seeing either ICE officers or Border Patrol officers performing federal enforcement actions, wearing masks and concealing their identities. What does the law say about officers covering their faces?
Well, there are basically two principles to keep in mind here. One is that if the federal government wants to do something and it's within the power of the federal government, then federal authority is supreme. So the states can't stop it, cities can't stop it. If you had a federal law that said ICE agents must wear masks, or even ICE agents shall wear masks if they want to, then that would kind of settle the issue. But you don't have that, so then the other principle comes into play, which is that if the federal government hasn't acted, you've got background state authority, and the states can have laws that apply to all people or all law enforcement agents, and those laws can set limits on what they can do. So, you've got public intoxication laws or drunk driving laws, and, an ICE officer can't say, gosh, I think I drive better when I've had a couple beers, and I'm a federal agent, so you can't stop me. No, there's a law there, and they have to follow it.
So then this becomes a state issue.
Yeah, so if you've got a state law that says no one can wear a mask, or law enforcement agents can't wear masks because we want to know who's a law enforcement agent and who's a criminal, that's a perfectly reasonable state measure to protect citizens. And if the federal government hasn't sort of actively taken a step to assert its authority over that issue, I would think that law should be fine.
It was interesting, on the ICE website, it states that ICE officers wear masks to, quote, prevent doxing, which can and has placed them and their families at risk, end quote. For those who don't know, doxing is when someone's personal information is put online without their permission. Is safety justification enough to cover your face when carrying out federal duties?
Well, so one of the other basic ideas here is that states can't stop a federal agency from carrying out its duties. So if it actually were necessary for ICE officers to wear masks, then even in the absence of some explicit congressional statute saying they can do it, a judge would probably say state law can't interfere with that. So you will have a question of whether wearing masks is necessary to the performance of the duties that ICE is charged with by statute.
Let me make sure I understand you here. Even if there is a state law, but if the federal government says these are duties that must be performed, then that state law could not prevent a federal officer from covering their identity.
If it is actually necessary to perform the function that Congress has charged them to carry out, then states can't interfere. So this goes back to basically the supremacy of federal authority. Congress says to ICE agents, do this particular thing, and it didn't say exactly how to do it, but the states are now saying you can't do this thing that is necessary to perform your federal function. That's going to be sort of an implied conflict with federal law, and the federal authority will prevail. So a judge is going to have to decide whether it's actually necessary for ICE agents to mask.
One critique of the masks that I saw by the ACLU and Human Rights Watch, which is actually a global monitoring organization, is that if officers are not identifiable, then they can't be held accountable. There are situations where there are multiple officers that are performing a federal immigration enforcement action, and an individual can't tell who is doing what because they're covering their faces to be able to then say what it is that happened to them. What do you think about that?
Well, first, the sad truth is it's very hard to hold federal officers accountable for civil rights violations. That's just the way the Supreme Court has set up the legal regime. But yes, at some point, I think it does violate the Constitution if federal agents are disguising themselves to avoid accountability. because we do have a constitution that's supposed to give individuals rights. And when those rights are violated, there's supposed to be a remedy. And the federal government cannot deliberately frustrate the ability of judges and ordinary citizens to hold the government to account for constitutional violations.
So what legal recourse do people have if they are stopped by a federal officer wearing a mask and the officer refuses to identify themselves?
Well, so under the current system, you've got to try to find the identity of the officer, from the agency afterwards. You're like, hey, I'm filing a suit, and I want you to tell me the identity of this person so I know who the proper defendant is. And they should tell you that if you're actually filing a suit.
Do they have to?
There are certain grounds on which they could withhold it. If it's actually necessary to protect the security of that person, or if it's necessary to perform the function of the federal agency, maybe. But generally, no. Generally, our government is supposed to follow the principle that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And agents of the government are supposed to be accountable to ordinary citizens for their actions.
Two former senior ICE officials told NBC News that the wearing of masks is unprecedented, that they have not seen this unless it involves a suspect that is a violent criminal. Could you see this practice now extending to other police departments under the same justification of the safety of officers?
Well, I could. I would be very unhappy to see that. But, this is one of the reasons why you don't want some federal agents concealing their identity, because other people might find it convenient too. One thing that you would worry about is this becomes standard practice for law enforcement, and then it's just much harder to hold law enforcement accountable for abuses. But then, of course, if you've got masked people running around saying, we're the police, do what we say, some people who aren't the police are going to start doing that. And then you'll get kidnappings and robberies carried out by people who are claiming to be ICE agents.
It doesn't seem like this is as simple as, you're an expert, constitutional law expert, that it's illegal, though. This seems like it's a very complicated legal matter. Is that the right read?
Yeah, it is complicated, and I think it's hard to be completely confident about how this case will come out. There are some things that could make it simpler. So if Congress passed a law saying ICE officials shall wear masks, that would make it pretty easy, because then the federal government would have clearly authorized this. In the absence of a law like that, that's why the judge is going to have to decide whether this is sort of inherently part of the ICE job description, because they can't do their jobs any other way, or whether it's more like, drunk driving or public intoxication, something that the states can restrict, because actually you don't need to do that to do your job. And the fact that ICE didn't mask until quite recently does sort of suggest to me that they don't need masks to do their job. But, on the other hand, there wasn't as much public resistance and hostility before either.
Professor Roosevelt, thank you so much for your time and your insight.
Thank you.